policy player. We are not a military superpower. We have not been one until World War II. By 1939, on the eve of World War II, Portugal, a little slice on the Atlantic Ocean, Portugal had a larger standing army than the United States of America. Right? So we do not have a strong military presence at this point in time. That is obviously going to change. The United States is, you could add the DRC, I guess, to that as well, but one of the rare countries that has both an economic superpower and a military superpower. That is going to emerge as a result of this. This early stage is going to be part of, again, a busy slide, nothing you need to memorize, nothing that's going to come back to you, but it's language that I'll use in regards to the nature of foreign policy. And some of these schools, particularly neoconservatism, is something we're not going to get back to until the 1970s, right? So I just have it up here. But the essence is that in terms of American foreign policy, we were part of something called a realist school of foreign policy, which meant what? A realist school of foreign policy says, listen, I can take it, I can do what I want, I have the power to do it. If we have more strength than Spain, we're going to take their damn colony in Cuba. If we're going to be more influential than Mexico, we're going to do what we want to in regards to their revolution. That realist school is very much what Putin is doing right now, saying, I don't believe that anyone is going to oppose me and threaten a war with Russia. I can do what I want to in Crimea. I can do what I want to in Ukraine. One and the same, obviously, it's going to say. This notion of focusing on the needs of these great powers is sort of driving us into, as we're going to see, global conflict. World War I is the product of the realist school, and it's driven by colonialism. So there's an irony here, is that all these kings and queens are going to get their ass booted out as a result of their countries taking colonies all over the world, right? So the chickens do kind of come home to roost. In this interim, right, particularly following World War I, America increasingly focuses on isolationism. That we don't care about the rest of the world, we don't care about what's going on in Europe, we don't care about what's going on in the Pacific Rim, and isolationism becomes sort of a watchword. What's the problem with that, right? Because we'd always been a relatively isolated country. The problem is our economy is not isolated. And if we want to continue to participate in a growing industrial capitalist society, we have to be able to find markets for our goods. And those goods there are competitors, right? We want to sell oil to Japan, well, so does Germany. How do we protect our expansionism? This kind of notion is focusing on domestic politics more than anything else, using foreign policy domestically to get an edge over a Republican or a Democratic opponent. Right? Again, we're very familiar with this. The last administration was nothing but kind of using foreign policy to be positioning Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other. Traditionally, at least in a World War II viewpoint, the argument is that foreign policy stops American partisanship, Republican, Democrat, stops at our borders. That is no longer the case, right? Isolationism says no, it's very much part of it. Protectionism, as we're going to see in the 1920s, is going to isolate the United States and harm our economics to the point where, quite honestly, we had a choice as to whether or not to stop our economic growth or participate in a more aggressive political stance. World War II, and this is what we're headed to, is often called the liberal internationalist, and I'll talk about that term liberal in just a second, or a globalist perspective. World War II demonstrates to the United States that if you want to be successful, if you want to have cheap gas prices in South Texas, in Corpus Christi, if you want to go to your Bed Bath & Beyond and buy the products that you want, if you want to go to Target and get the stuff that you want, you have to be a part of a global economy. You have to be part of a society that is going to say, we're going to protect basic civil liberties in people's lives because it is the source of an economic font that is going to drive American society. So we're going to see this in the Cold War, particularly the lessons learned from World War II, is that if you are the largest and most powerful liberal democracy on the planet, you have got to lead. You don't have a choice. If you don't, others will take those possessions from you. Right? And so that sense of a globalist or liberal internationalist is focused on this idea that the United States is compelled to lead because of its size, because of its importance, because of the values supposedly that we uphold. And as I mentioned, when we get to the 1970s, we're going to see a neoconservatism, which is sort of a realist school, but in essence, it's going to argue that American values, not American economics or do the right thing or make sure everyone's living in constitutional states, that American values should be driving foreign policy. And what this is going to affect, as we get to the end of the course, is our relationship with Israel and the Middle East. So Israel is going to have a troubled relationship with the United Nations, which the United States creates. The United States is going to argue, well, because of our values, we're going to support Israel. And that is going to cause, needless to say, all kinds of problems with the established states in the region. So stay tuned to that. But it is also going to justify a war in Iraq, where the argument is that we are going to destroy the old nation and rebuild a new one. While a lot of talk about this is going to come out of the Reagan administration, not the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, Clinton, it's George W. Bush. It's the Iraq War, which is probably the best example of neoconservatism, right? There's no reason to invade that country other than the fact that we label them an axis of evil, and we want them to change. We want to change. We have deigned that we're going to change their society. Colin Powell, rest in peace. You break it, you bought it, and we broke. We break it, and we have to deal with the consequences of that. The point here is that the language that I'm going to be using is largely focused on, we know where we're headed. We're headed towards this post-World War II world, the world you and I were both raised in, which is that the United States is a global leader. People look to the United States. All of the intel that the U.S. and the current administration was releasing about Russia before this incursion into Ukraine, all of that notion of saying they are going to invade, all of the world is looking to the United States to make those kind of proclamations, to look at that. That's where we're headed, okay? Last point in terms of terminology, I'll use this phrase, liberal democracy. This is not Republican Democrats. Again, it's not third grade. It's not call-in hour for Rush Limbaugh and God rest his soul. This is not talk radio. Liberal democracy simply means liberalism makes the argument, Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal politically in the United States. Liberalism makes the argument that a state should have a written constitution which will then guarantee the civil liberties of the people who live there. They have certain rights, inalienable rights, life, liberty, and property. Right? In our Constitution, you have rights, First Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Second Amendment, all of these things are, and that there are institutions that are going to be protected, that's going to hold the government in check. Most notably, our judicial system, but also a free and fair press. Right? That those institutions are there. Right? People always like to say the First Amendment is, I can say what I want and I can have whatever religion I want. Yes, yes. What's the third one? That the press can go on and criticize people in power, and it has to if you want to have a free and fair society. Democracy is pretty self-explanatory, that periodically, once a year, once every 4 years, once whenever, that people have a way in which to redefine who has access to power. And I guess after January 6th, the people are willing to support the idea that democracy is going to produce change. And if you don't like the change, well, too bad. Wait for the next election. Don't go and attack the U.S. Capitol. Right? So liberal democracy is not. I had a good friend of the family. Used to live on the South Side when our boys were little. And one of their best friends, young girl in the region, and she was really bright. She was artistic and all that, but she was raised in a very. She herself was very conservative. Great, loved her. She's fantastic. But she started crying to me one time because she knew that I worked in the College of Liberal Arts. And she's like, I didn't know you were a liberal. I was like, no. That's not what that means. That does not mean, Rush Limbaugh kind of stuff. What it means is, and we'll get back to this, what it means are certain values in terms of what people, human beings, are interested in culturally and who they are and how they think about themselves. So don't confuse when I'm saying liberal democracies with conservatism or Republican or Democrat. The other thing is true with authoritarian states. They can be the right, they can be in the left. Communism can produce an authoritarian state. Fascism, conservative populism, What those mean is, in essence, all of those assumptions about these are your rights as citizens are all now subject to change. They're all under the pressure of a centralized state which controls the press, which controls the military, and largely is going to, for their own purposes, alienate and vilify people within them. All right? So again, it's a wordy way in which to say when I'm referring to liberalism and liberal democracy, I'm not talking about people who vote a certain way. I'm talking about the nature of the countries that we're going to be talking about. Cultural authoritarian is obviously something we'll get to later on. Religion is a cultural belief. The reason you have the religion you have is because of the family you were born into, plain and simple. Right? You're born into another family, you may have a very different religion. That's a cultural phenomenon. Okay, the origins, all right, here we go back to real history. The origins of this realist school is going to be seen emerging during that first McKinley administration. William McKinley, election of 1896. Why is it so important? A lot of you talked about that one, right? And there's a number of ways in which you could go. You could also talk about foreign policy, right? Some of you did. Some of you did mention Cuba, right? You know, but Cuba comes a little bit later. Right? This foreign policy is going to be established in terms of the perspective that the United States has towards the rest of the world. And scholars beginning to write about this are often going to refer to it as the tragedy of American diplomacy. Right? Tragedy is a really interesting word here, and I think it's appropriate. Tragedy is not something sad that's happened, right? A busload of babies and nuns, whatever, going over a cliff is a sad event, but is it tragic? No. Tragedy, if you're an English major or a theater major, and are familiar with William Shakespeare. Shakespeare is this, English language writer, but one of the greatest of all time. Phenomenal in terms of his ability to dramatize tragedy, right? At your age in life, my suggestion is to either see a performance or read Hamlet. Because Hamlet is a tragic figure. He is a young person, just starting his life. And all of a sudden, the ghost of his dead dad shows up and says, guess what? Your uncle killed me. And you've got to make some restitution. You've got... The rest of the play, to be or not to be, is a young person, is a teen, right? He's probably younger than most people here. He's looking around going, if I kill a king, what's going to happen to me? I'm in big trouble, right? And what does it mean to give your life for a dead father? What do I owe myself? What do I owe the woman I love? She's going to die. Everybody does. Tragedy is character. Tragedy, why does character matter in American elections, of whether someone has character and the statements they make about other people? Because character is going to drive the decisions of people. If you were to ask most Americans about the rest of the world, most of us don't have a really good grasp of it, right? Where's Vietnam? Oh, it's that way. Where's Afghanistan? Oh, it's over here. Where's Ukraine? Oh, it's somewhere, I'm not sure, right? Why is that? Because we've got lives that don't require that knowledge, right? You don't need that knowledge to go fill up your car. You don't need that knowledge to go to your job. You don't need that knowledge to live your life and have fun and meet, people and all that kind of stuff. We have it lucky. We don't have other countries who are pressing in on us and having their perspectives. We don't have a Canada and Mexico saying, well, if you don't do what we say, you're gonna be affected negatively by that. So Americans generally don't have, if we think at all about what we would like the rest of the world, if you could wave a magic wand and say, how would the rest of the world look, right? By and large, most Americans would say, give them democracy. I want them, it seems to be okay. It seems to work here. And if you think at all in economic terms, give them that sort of industrial capitalism, consumer, give them an economic system that's sort of like ours. It seems to have worked. It seems to have been successful, right? That notion of American public looking around going, we would love to see the rest of the world look like us. We would love to see the rest of the world look like Ukraine, right? Look like but we really don't take much interest in it. And we really don't elect people based on those values until after World War II. What the rest of the world sees, what is tragic about this? What the rest of the world sees is an economic superpower emerging and starting to say, Hawaii, this is what we want you to do. Cuba, this is what we want you to do. Vietnam, this is what we want you to do. And those people having their own history, having their own national history, right? Of saying, well, wait a minute, we're kind of with you. Right? I don't have time to talk about the instance of Hawaii. Hawaii is a perfect example. Independent nation, They wanted a constitution, they used the United States Constitution as its model. And we're like, no, we want that territory for ourselves. We want that as a military base. The Philippines, right? We have an occupation in the Philippines the last 3 years. We outlawed the publication of the US Constitution in the Philippines. It was too radical, right? They're seeing the United States as the redcoats, right? And we don't like, we fought the redcoats in the revolution. They're seeing the United States in one perspective. We see ourselves, if we think at all about foreign policy, as the good guys. And that conflict, that sense of obligation, of saying you just can't sit back and, oh, well, I don't really care where Vietnam is a luxury that you can't have when you are as big and as important and as consequential as the United States becomes by mid-century. So that's the argument here. Not that the United States is bad, not that we should feel guilty, it's that the values of our people are not seen the same way around the rest of the world. And again, if you travel beyond this country, what you're going to find is people like Americans, people like American culture, right? And their big question is, why the hell do you act this way? What's up with Vietnam? Right now, it's a long time ago. We don't get it. It seems that you stand for everything that we're going towards, but we don't get your policies, right? And by and large, this notion of America expanding beyond its boundaries is a false question. We've always been expanding, right? If you look at the American Revolution, little band of colonies along the East Coast. Suddenly it goes all the way to the Mississippi. Suddenly it goes to the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean. There are people who live there. There are Native Americans. There are Mexicans, right? We take 2/3 of Mexico. That ain't the Gulf of Texas out there, right? That was someone else's land. The idea that somehow the United States was not an expansionist country is false from its premise. What happens by 1890, right, is that in essence we run out of land in North America to take. But as late as 1912, I think the Taft administration is still talking about annexing land in Canada. They're still talking about taking the Pacific coast from the Canadians, right? We're still talking about expansion. But we don't have, in essence, that notion of a frontier that's open to us. And one where you can move out and start over and keep, kind of trying to press yourself to try and do new things in that different region. What we've got is an economy that demands exports. Right? Over $1 billion by 1890. And the question becomes, are we just simply going to stop and have a domestic economy? Or are we going to market our goods in the Pacific Rim, or in Africa, or in Europe, or in Central and South America? And when you look at those regions, what you see are other European countries already there. And the question is are we going to fight our way into those marketplaces? Do we care enough about our own expansion to be able to take on those European powers? These psychological factors are also starting to play, and Teddy Roosevelt's a perfect example of that. Teddy Roosevelt, I sort of championed as a national progressive. He's also an imperialist par excellence, right? He's looking and saying, here's this young, brash, expanding industrial powerhouse in the United States, and by God, we are men, right? It's all loaded with masculinity. And we're going to stand up against these these weak imperialistic monarchs of Europe. The United States is this emerging power. Germany is an emerging power. Japan is an emerging power. And we'll get back to all three of those countries, right? Because they're going to be the three of the dominant countries of World War II. And they are not. One of the things the king of Germany is going to say, Germany is a relatively late emerging country. Germany doesn't exist before 1870, right? They want a place in the sun, these Germans. They're like, we are a strong emerging economy. The U.S. is drawn to that as well, as we're going to understand, right? All of this stuff is kind of floating around. There's a sense at the turn of the century. The McKinley election, we're leaning into industrial capitalism. We're an emerging superpower economically. We should play internationally. All this is floating around. And the first major policy is going to come from an academic, of all people, Albert Thayer Mahan. He teaches at the Naval War College. He teaches at basically what is going to become Annapolis, right? And he's a historian, historians. And he's looking around and saying, what makes a world power in history? Look at the Athenians, look at the Phoenicians, look at the Romans, look at the Spaniards, look at the Dutch, look at the British. What they all have in common is they have a deep water fleet, or blue water fleet, right? A fleet that can go long distances and project power. And the US doesn't have squat, right? Now we have a lot of mercantile, we have a lot of local commerce, right? So again, you can have ships all over the place who are out in the Gulf and who are whaling and all that kind of stuff. He's talking here about projecting real force. What if you want to protect your investments in Hawaii? What do you need? You need to have the ability, mechanically, militaristically, to do that. And what Mahan is arguing for is that the United States, if they're going to be a great power, must be able to produce this military hardware. Previously, the United States didn't do that. Why? Because there was no market need for it. There's a small federal government. Last thing they're going to do is start building a big military, right? Who creates the need for an aircraft carrier? Who's going to buy one here in Corpus Christi? Nobody, right? It's later on Dwight Eisenhower's going to call it the military-industrial complex. It is the driving force, the economy. This is not market-driven. This is socialism. This is the federal government saying we are going to build these things because it has a purpose that we want. There's no market forces that are doing this. So again, if that blows your head up, then maybe you have too easy of an understanding of terms like socialism and liberalism and whatnot. What is picked up by Teddy Roosevelt and Charles Evan Hughes and William Howard Taft, etc., is building the first deep water fleet for the United States. And is referred to as the Great White Fleet, not because of any racial categorizations. If you have Navy people, all my family is mostly in the Navy or Army. They're all spit and polished, they're all titanium paints, they're all clean that up kind of stuff, kind of guys and women. And they're using that same stuff on this, because if you go out in seawater, it's very caustic against steel and iron and what have you, and so the paint is actually necessary. But these are modern armaments of war. These are probably 14-inch guns right here. 14-inch, the shell that comes out. By the time we get to World War II, they have 36-inch guns. The guys who were landing in Iwo Jima would talk about the garbage cans coming in. Those were the shells that these battleships were shooting, because they looked like someone was shooting a garbage can, right? This craft right here could be 10 miles offshore and park a shell within 100 feet of this room right here, right? It could project force, needless to say. But what do these things need? They need coaling. They need coal to refuel. They have men on them that are going to need rest and relaxation when they get to a base. They need secure locations. And so to have a deep water fleet means to project force internationally. Who has deep water fleet abilities, right? Who has the ability to pull something like this in? Not Corpus Christi. Right? You ever flying to Corpus? What do you see in the ship channel? It looks pretty cool. I mean, it's almost like, they dredge it. We have to dredge our ship channel because it fills up with silt. The Mississippi River dumps all this silt into the Gulf, and it all comes right down the coast of Texas, and it plops. We get dusty here. So we don't have a deep water fleet or deep water port. Who does? San Francisco does. New York to a limited extent. Galveston's not bad, right? But overseas, Hawaii. You ever gone to Hawaii, Honolulu, right? You can pull one of these heavy fleets right up to the shore. Manila Bay, Luzon, in Manila, the Philippines. All of these regions are places where the U.S. is going to look and say, these are essential ports where we know our military is going to at least be able to take a breather and fill up on fresh water, and fill up on coal, and fill up on food, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So this Great White Fleet presents an opportunity in which American can begin to express force. And if I was to do a Gilded Age class like I did last semester, we talked in depth about all three of these. I'm going to look simply at the Caribbean because it's the most obvious. But the Pacific Rim, the clear assumption is that China, and again, it's not just China, it's the entire Pacific Rim. It's the Indonesia, it's all those regions have all kinds of possibilities. The problem being is that the Europeans are already there. Right? Hawaii, as when we get to World War II, is right smack dab in the middle of the Pacific, and makes it pretty convincing or useful to kind of look at that as a way station getting from point A to point B. Same thing is true with the Canal Zone in Panama and whatnot. Right? So again, I'm kind of cutting back the coverage here, but focusing on one in particular, which is the Caribbean. Right. With that as a backdrop, then, what you see in essence is a growing concern over the United States kind of marshaling control over what is generally referred to as Mesoamerica. It's basically everything from what we would see today from the Isthmus of Panama all the way up to the United States. Generally, Mexico can and cannot be considered in there. Mexico is a close ally of the United States, has been for most of its history. You know, the rest of the world has real dangerous neighbors. We got Canada and Mexico, and that's one of our greatest assets, is that we don't have hostile neighbors around us on either side. People would cite the Monroe Doctrine as being sort of a precedent of the United States involving itself in the region. And effectively, again, this is not a 1301 class, but the Monroe Doctrine comes largely as a statement by the president, by President Monroe, to try and slow down the British involvement in the Western Hemisphere, the British control over the Western Hemisphere. But we had no enforcement mechanism, we had no military. European powers are looking at the United States and literally laughing at us by saying, well, you won't come in here, we'll push you out, right? By the time we get to 1865, there are more European powers in the Western Hemisphere than there were when the Monroe Doctrine was first promulgated, right? So it's not as if the United States was either feared or had a military capability to stop them. Latin American republics, and these are all liberal democracies, right? They're all booting out the Spanish colonial masters and establishing constitutional states, are going through the same kind of growing pains that the United States went through in 1800 and 1890, 1790, etc. And we're looking at this going, there's all kinds of concern here about destabilizing the region. Chile, and Venezuela, and Mexico, particularly under Juarez. Benito Juarez is a full-blooded Zapotec Indian, right? By the time we get to Diaz after the revolution is going to basically do, or before the revolution is going to do everything the United States wants him to do. But they're looking and saying these are areas where we do not have complete control. What makes Cuba important is that not only is it one of the richest regions in terms of what it produces, sugarcane and fruit and all kinds of stuff that's really marketable, but also is a colonial possession of Spain. It is one of the last remaining colonial possessions of the Spanish Empire that dates back to the 1500s. Right? We are in the 1900s here. That is 400 years. And in essence, what you're looking at here is this notion of saying the United States can pick on Spain because Spain can't do anything about it. That's realism. That's realist school. That is saying we want a toehold in the region, and you're the easiest subject in which to do it. And again, the media is going to pick up on this. The media is in the business of doing what? Getting you to tune in tomorrow. Now, we don't have television yet, but we do have newspapers, getting you mad enough so that you pick up and buy a paper. And both these guys, Pulitzer's on the top, Hearst, I'm sorry, that's William Randolph Hearst, that's Joseph Pulitzer, right? Both of these guys have something brand new, which is a penny press. These are mass production newspapers, and they have to sell a boatload of these things to make money. And how do you make sure people tune in tomorrow? You have specific editorialists, you have TV shows right today. People are going to say all kinds of things. Oh, well, we're going to have, there's a pizza shop that's got a pedophile ring, right? What? I got to tune in tomorrow. All of this bullshit is going to be pressed into the media to sell newspapers, right? That's what the yellow press is interested in. They don't care about the foreign affairs and what have you. These are going to, in essence, create an environment where they're constantly pressuring William McKinley to act on Cuba. The Cuban revolutionaries, Jose Marti and others, know this. They know that Americans don't know squat about Cuba, and everything they know, they learn from the newspapers. They turn on TV, and it tells them what to feel and how to think, right? And so they're consciously goading, in essence, American interest. You need to protect us. You need to get out here. The Spanish are misruling. The Spanish are putting us in concentration camps. They're not, right? They're using this, and the press is effectively saying that William McKinley is soft. He doesn't know what to do, right? He's not vice president yet, but Teddy Roosevelt, at the same time, is commenting publicly that William McKinley has no more backbone than a chocolate eclair, than a donut. Right? So it's even Teddy is saying this kind of stuff. All of this reaches a crescendo in the late 1898, where McKinley is looking and saying, we're not an imperialist country. We're not just going to step in and take over another country. And Enrique de Lome, who is the Spain is a liberal democracy. They have a constitutional monarchy, right? So they're not, and they're not, this kind of authoritarian government in any way, shape, or form. Enrique de Lome is the ambassador to the United States. He sends a cable back to Madrid in which he effectively says what I just told you, and that is that McKinley is divided. He doesn't have a strong position on what's going on in Cuba. He largely is being kicked around by the media, and his own Republican Party doesn't have a very strong view of him because you've got people like Teddy Roosevelt who's criticizing from within. When this letter gets sent, it is intercepted by American intelligence. And the minute these two men have access to it, they make public. This is what the Spanish say about our president. Our president is soft. Our president is weak. Our president is this, that, or the other thing. Right? Now if you're a Republican or Democrat, often, well, they always say that about the opposing president. Trump's an idiot. Biden is whatever. But having a foreigner say that, well, by God, we need to do something. What are we going to do? We take one of our Great White Fleet ships, the USS Maine, and send it down and park it right in the middle of Havana Harbor. You want to mess with us, Spain? This is who you're messing with. You're messing with somebody who has got this kind of technology. Not unlike Putin going and saying, well, I'm going to get my staff ready for a nuclear exchange. While the Maine is parked in Havana Harbor, it explodes. Right? The Navy knows right away that this is a potential cause of war, causa belli. The U.S. Department of Navy does not take 2 years, like after 9/11, or now over a year for January 6th, to begin their investigation. They report on what they find in terms of the hull, which you see over here. That's the main, what was left of it. 97 American soldiers are going to die. What the United States Navy discovers is that there was I forgot the terminology, it's always underwhelming. There was a significant malfunction in the magazine, the place that keeps all the explosives. And either someone made a mistake, there was a spark, there was something, but all of the explosions, all of the metal, all of the steel is blowing outward. Meaning what? Meaning there was a mistake that blew the ship up from within. What the press picks up is, oh no, we've been attacked. We've been attacked. Remember the name to hell with Spain. We've been attacked by Spain. Was it torpedo? Was it this? Was it that? And the Americans feel as if, McKinley feels as if his national honor, his honor as a president, is so imperiled that he needs to act. And what they do is declare war on Spain, right? Now by this point in time, 1898, 400 years, Spain is a badass in the 1500s and the 1600s. They are not industrializing at a clip like the British and the French and the Germans and the Russians and the Americans. They are a westernized society, a very capable westernized society, but they have not invested in military technology, right? What the United States does is to declare war on the entire Spanish colonial possessions. So we just had our ship sunk in Havana Harbor, and we declare war, and where are we going to attack? Manila, right? Of course, what? Right? What we're looking at here's China, here's French Indochina, Vietnam, right? He said our first area of attack is going to be the possessions that the Spanish have in the Pacific Rim, most notably the Philippines. And again, if you haven't been there, you wouldn't know. I've never been to the Philippines, but this area right here is a natural deep water harbor. You can use that as a base in which to begin to have trade and protect trade in the region. When we get there, Emiliano Aguinaldo, just like Jose Marti, is going to thank God the Americans are here. The Americans oppose they fight the redcoats. The Americans are for freedom. The Americans are for classic capitalism. The Americans have all these values of liberal democracies. That ain't what we bring, right? What we do is occupy and for the next 3 years fight anyone who is attempting to dislodge the Americans from the region as opposed to the Spaniards, right? Tragic. Most Americans are like, we don't know where the Philippines are, and by the way, if we're in control, let's make them like Iowa, right? Let's give them a constitution, let's give them the Second Amendment, let's do the things that we do here that seem to work. We as Americans think one thing about ourselves and what we'd like to spread around the globe. What is evident to people living there is that, oh, there's just the new boss, right? That's going to come back in a real difficult way when we get to Vietnam, needless to say, right? 11,000 American troops occupy the island 3 years. We use waterboarding, where it's written into the Army Field Manual that waterboarding is now a dischargeable offense. We use torture. As I mentioned, Aguinaldo is going to use the American Constitution, and it's going to be identified as propaganda that is worth incarceration. So if they're publishing the American Constitution in Spanish language, they're going to be arrested. Not necessarily the position that you would normally see or want to see the United States taking in this regard. Cuba is obviously the jewel in the crown, and again, the Spanish Navy in this case is not a modern Navy. They are putting wooden-hulled ships still to sea. This is not a typo. The Navy loses 1 fatality in battle on their first engagement. It just is. It's David and Goliath. In this case, Goliath doesn't get hit with the shell. The land battle is much different, and here the fight of the war is so short, literally about 120 days, that you have all these people scrambling to get access to. William Jennings Bryan is the colonel who creates his own unit. Teddy Roosevelt, who is embarrassed by the fact that his father brought his way out of Civil War, right, is going to rush as quickly as possible to get in on the fighting. Splendid little war. The land battles that they're involved in are pretty tight, right? I mean, these are not easy conflicts. These are pretty scary things. Roosevelt has bullets shot at him and his short horse shot out from him. He's going to form a group called the Rough Riders, made of the toughest men, literally the language he uses, that he knows, which include football players from Ivy League schools. So football at this point in time was largely an Ivy League sport, and Western cowboys, right? And you can see these Rough Riders kind of coming by. Not belittling the danger they put themselves in, or not noting the fact that African Americans are going to serve as American soldiers, defending the United States, what have you. They're going to be seeing this war as an opportunity in which to present something of themselves. And a British poet by the name of Rudyard Kipling, guy who wrote Jungle Book and all these other things, Mobley characters and what have you, is a British imperialist. He's somebody who's in India, and he's like, the British should control India, and the French should control Vietnam, and a bunch of different countries should control China. And the United States, you should control Philippines and Spain. You should be redcoats, right? And the language of this is very clearly dealing with those psychological factors I was talking about before. We're an emerging superpower. We're manly, right? We got a waxed mustache or something like that. Be done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel that eats young grudge praise. Come down to search your manhood. How do we know we have manhood? Because we're invading Cuba. Thanks through all the thankless years, cold, edged with dear-bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Who are the peers? At least in this poem. European monarchs. That's what we had a revolution for. That's what we have a constitution for. So that monarchs look up to us, right? And you can see this. Here's TR as president. Roosevelt later on is going to have a policy of speak softly but carry a big stick. The idea being, it's an African proverb, the idea being is that the United States, and while it may not look modern, Teddy Roosevelt was once the police captain of the city of New York, and he institutes, if you're into criminal justice, it's the 1890s where you start to see the formation of professional policing and constable on patrols, that kind of thing, and Roosevelt is going to have it. But you can see him sort of standing here as this big tough guy in the middle of these European weirdos, right, with all these kind of weird kind of traditional clothing, and what Teddy referred to as his little brown cousins, right? Those who were from Central and South America, people who were, it's like the Manana group on here. Same thing with this political cartoon as well. The United States is going to have these people of color who are going to, in a sense, need to be turned into these high-browed white people in the back. Right? So it's tinged with all of this idea of racial superiority and what the United States should do. Right? On Wednesday, I'll pick this up again and kind of swing us back.